Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Game Crimes, the show that gives you a little taste of the black market history of video games. I am your host. My name is Jay. I am joined here with my co-host, Mike Bachmann, who does not introduce himself. Isn't that right? You don't do introductions?
Hell yeah. Thanks, folks. We'll be here all episode.
We got the rhythm worked out perfectly. That's right. You're here to learn a little bit of video game history from two people who act like if the Marx brothers weren't formally educated.
I'm sorry. My favorite silent movie actor is Michael Keaton. It wasn't until I hit 30 that I realized that he wasn't a silent movie actor, just the volume on my TV was broken.
We're going to start the first of a three-part series examining communities in video games, communities that exist outside of the law and have contributed significantly to the history of video games. Today is an interesting topic, one that some folks might be unfamiliar with. It's called fan translations, and it is exactly what it sounds like. This is a game that has been published in another country or another language, and folks within a different country have taken the opportunity to modify the game's code to be playable in other languages. And there's a whole bunch of history here that we're going to dive into eventually. Mike, I think the interesting thing here about fan translations is that they've been around for a very long time. Yeah. I mean, as long as I have been on the internet, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first one that I played was Mario's Wrecking Crew on the Super Nintendo.
Oh, geez. Yeah. So that would have been mid-90s.
Right.
So even when these games were coming out, they were getting translated soon after. But there's a whole history behind this, and we are about to get into it.
You said it was a three-part series. The next part is 16-bit murder squads.
Losing it over here. So I'd like to go over a brief history of fan translations, how they work, and what they are. As far as I could find, the first known fan translations of computer games were done in the late 80s, early 90s. And formally, the earliest one that can be traced is traced back to 1993. A group of ROM hackers, people who edit video game code in order to change how the game works, named Oasis, translated a couple of games on a Japanese computer system, the MSX, into Dutch, and then from Dutch got translated into English. These games were shipped on floppy disks, so it was a lot easier to distribute these fan translations. You could just plop it on a disk and mail it to someone.
The English translation actually came from the Dutch translation? So it's translated through two languages before it gets to English?
You got it.
Wow.
And I believe the same translations were also translated into French as well, so... it's kind of weird. It spread like a spider web once the first few got out. From what I can tell, they were mainly distributed on Usenet, which doesn't surprise me. I'm going to give you a list of games. SD Snatcher, Legend of Heroes, Zack, The Art of the Stage, Rune Master, Ys. I mean, have you played any of those?
I tried to play one of the early Ys games. I played Snatcher. I mean, I'm assuming that's being MSX. That was Snatcher that ended up on the Sega CD.
Actually, that's SD Snatcher, the one that's super deformed and cutesy.
Oh, no, I have not played that.
Okay. So I guess the point I wanted to make is it's not like this was a well-known thing. You would have to be into extremely nerdy games. Let's fast forward to 1996. From 93 to 96, a whole lot changes in the internet, and that is a completely different story, but it becomes more widespread across the world, and files become easier to share. At the time, there was sort of an arms race going on forums and newsletters, where different teams of ROM hackers were all racing to translate the same game into English. Final Fantasy V is the game in question. Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy is a relatively famous game series. So the idea that there was a Final Fantasy game untranslated into English set off a bunch of alarms in the nerd communities. From what I can tell, Mike, there were 6 different teams fighting to get this translation out first. And this would make it the first console game to be translated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we had Archaic Runes, Multiple Demoforce, the Translations Corporation, D-Japanese Translation, Starsoft Translations, and RPGE. RPGE was the first successful translation group which distributed an English patch for Final Fantasy V in October 1997. And a little bit of fun queer history, co-authored by a trans woman. And the funny thing about Final Fantasy V is that eventually all those translations came out. So there are like a billion different translations for one game. The race to Final Fantasy V actually excited a lot of people who were maybe unfamiliar with the ROM hacking scene. And so you started to see translations for other games popping up. By 1998, you can see websites that basically house repositories or libraries of patches start popping up. Two specifically that listeners might be familiar with if they're old like myself, RPG Dimension and the Whirlpool. Nowadays, these websites that collect translation patches have been supplanted by romhacking.net, which is the premier place to be looking into these translations, as well as ROM hacks. There are other translations websites out there, and they're good, don't get me wrong, but romhacking.net is huge. If you're looking for in-progress patches, you can find them on smaller subforums like GBA Temp. Then we're going to move on to 1999. 1999 is significant because this is the first time a full legal injunction has been filed against a fan translator. Now, this fan translator was simply translating a RPG game dev kit called RPG Maker 95 for Windows. RPG Maker is still being created and distributed. You can buy it on Steam. The game's Japanese developer, ASCII, shut down the group entirely by bringing them to court and threatening to essentially run them up on copyright charges. And the group agrees to disband and take down their translations in exchange for getting out of the court case. So there is no formal legal proceeding, but it's enough of a threat to work. Does that make sense legally, I guess? Yeah. I mean, if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah, but also like wouldn't set any sort of precedent.
In 2010, Xseed Games, which is a game publisher that specializes in bringing Japanese games over to the US, actually paid a fan translation group for one of their translations instead of paying an internal translation team. That game is called East, the Oath of Felghana, and it was formally distributed with that English translation, and all of the translators got development credit. There's a weird relationship between formal game developers and this community, where you see a lot of their work showing up in formally published games, but whether or not they get credit for it or get paid for it is a different issue.
Yeah.
I think in this case, it's interesting because Xseed Games they're not a game developer. They don't make games. They only publish them. And so it would make sense to me in that case to just pay a software team to, hey, give me a finished version of this because you've already delivered it before.
But in the case of like a fan translation, like are they even like a team really? You know, it's like how much work is just being shared among people doing it in their free time without like record of how much time is spent on that, like who's getting paid for that and what legal like, you know, things are you opening yourself up to?
There's so many complications there because generally speaking, the game industry has used the translation community as a product testing ground. The reason why this community is allowed to thrive is because a lot of the times the fan translators become formal translators. But you have to do a bunch of unpaid work first to prove you can do the job.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great.
I've got one more date of note here, 2014. Probably one of the most significant fan translations of the past 10 years. A PSP game called Final Fantasy Type 0 did not make it over to the US due to the failure of that system in the Western market. And Squaresoft, the game's publishers, actually issued a formal cease and desist order to the fan translation group. Once again, escalating things, trying to get things into the court of the law. In this case, he refuses, and the translation patch is left up as is. He agreed to take it down, and it was distributed basically on other sites by other people within minutes.
Excellent. You take somebody to court in the 90s, like maybe you have a chance of getting it taken down and not being out there anymore. But once, I mean, 2014, no, if it was out there at all, it's out there.
For sure. And I mean, Square eventually turned around and released that game with a different translation. Just because they were like, hey, there's a market for it. I'm hoping that like by presenting these things in chronological order, I've communicated the idea that like This is kind of a section of game hacking and ROM hacking that's been mostly left alone. Compared to like some of the things we've seen with like emulation sites being shut down, ROM hackers actually being brought to court, like in the Gloob Game Genie versus Nintendo case. This is just strictly fan communities.
Is it a case where it's left alone for the same reason that like ROM hacking will distribute like an IPS patch for the ROM and not a patched version of the ROM? Because then they're not distributing original code?
Kind of. Actually, that is a good segue. Legality-wise, like I said, gray area. There is a generally accepted belief that distributing a game patch itself is legal, so long as you are not distributing the game itself. So you'd be sent, a tiny little file that you would somehow append to an existing game. From all the research I've done, this belief has never actually been tested in court. There are arguments that it might fall under the umbrella of fair use, but as anyone who has spent any amount of time on YouTube knows, that term in legal consequences is complicated. I went and looked up a legal guide specifically about fan translations on hellbraunlaw.com, and here's what Hellbraun has to say. The answer lies in fair use. The fair use doctrine provides a limit on the powers of copyright holders and permits and requires courts to avoid rigid application of the copyright statute when, on occasion, it would stifle the very creativity the law is designed to foster. If you don't speak legal, that might give you a headache. So let me try to put it into like normal people words. Fair use is another way of saying you're using some element in an existing piece of art to make some new, individual, unique, separate piece of art. A good example would be if you watch a movie and they do like a James Bond parody. That's not illegal because it's a parody. The parody falls under the application of fair use. If you're making a YouTube video where you're chopping up your favorite clips from one of your movies, that's a little grayer. Some of the larger distribution channels have argued that that is piracy, and others have said that because copyright law is meant to foster the creation of new material, these things fall under that umbrella. It's phenomenally interesting to me, Mike, as someone who has to write legal jargon for a living, that every single YouTube community seems to have a really hot take on what fair use is. Have you seen this kind of argument? Because I feel like it's been cycling around the internet forever.
I've been a part of it. Well, I guess the difference between me is that I don't make any claim that anything I'm doing is fair use.
Yes,
but,
yeah.
But like I've done performed parodies and stuff for like music for
Sure.
like GeeklyCon live shows, and then later, had people be like, oh, you should release that, and I was like, well, I just ripped a karaoke track, right. Like that, I don't think it's fair use.
Everybody loved your rendition of the thong song.
Very little was changed.
My personal hot take on fair use is that the law is very broadly defined. The legal history is all over the place. And that kind of sucks because it leaves small creators the burden of determining whether or not they're doing fair use. For the most part, in the US legal system, large corporations and moneyed interests have the ability to determine that law. And therefore, there's an eternal fight over what is fair use and what isn't. And it's done in little individual bits. A good recent example would be Twitch, the streaming website, kind of not being in control of whether or not you're going to get hit for music. If you're playing copyright written music or something, even within a game itself, you've seen a lot of game publishers, movie publishers, etc., claiming that playing a game by itself and using the original audio does not constitute fair use. And
it's one of those areas where it's like, the people that are going to get hit by something like this are less likely to have like the resources to either like truly understand it or navigate it. And oftentimes, even when like the company that's gonna, as we saw earlier, like even if they may not be right, the threat of a large company saying, take it down, or we're gonna do a legal action to you. It's just like is enough to be like, oh, well, I just, I think I'm right, but I don't know. And I don't have the resources to find out. So I'm just going to stop.
Yeah. So I'm going to use my work experience here because I work for a lot of patent law firms as a researcher. One thing that very much leads into what you were saying, that notion of, smaller people who don't have the resources. One thing that's very common in my job is that if I'm asked to find some material and it's a really important case, my availability, budget, time spent on these projects could range from 24 hours to 4 months. Imagine having to stretch out what you're doing over 4 months and trying to find the resources while still paying your bills as like your mortgage and your heat and your light and that kind of thing.
Not an army of people named Bill that you made some bad bets. They were all to somebody who happened to have the same first name, and now you got to deal with that.
You found one forum and that was just based on guys named Bill, and that's on you, man. You could have turned away. Here's the thing that scares me about fan translations. I'm going to give you a little vision of the future. There are cases of the bad guys winning, corporations having their say and having these resources taken down or destroyed. In Sweden, there used to be a website named Undertexter. Very cool. Very cool. And it reminds me of a graveyard, which is how you know it's a good translation. They offered a huge repository of subtitles, fan-made subtitles for TV shows, anime, film, etc. But Swedish law does not allow for individuals to make transcripts of film without the copyright owner's permission.
I'm going to jail.
Mike's going to jail for fan subbing several things that we cannot talk about.
I always thought if I was going to go to jail, it would be for that guy I killed, but nope. This is what finally got me.
In July 2013, the BBC reported that servers and computers belonging to the owners of Undertexter, all of these servers and all of these computers were actually seized by Swedish police. And in a statement made in Facebook, representatives of Undertexter stated that their service is powered by fan-made translations provided for free to the public. People using the site were sharing just text files for films and shows they watched. They weren't sharing any of the files themselves. However, the Swedish National Chief of Intellectual Property Crime, yikes, Paul Pinter, stated that our copyright law doesn't allow people to make a transcript from a film that is copyright protected without the copyright owner's permission, and certainly not to make it public. The potential penalties for such actions range from fines up to 2 years in jail.
What if my memory's just really good?
I'm going to do a little reading series here. It is an interesting reading series. It's a huge article that you can find on Polygon. The title is A Peek into the Underground World of Fan-Translated Games by Alexa Ray Corriea. The earliest part of this article is about the Mother 3 project. Mother 3 being a very popular Japanese game that was never released in English-speaking regions. There had been an enormous race to get this game translated, similar to the race we talked about in Final Fantasy V. The problem is that the project turned out to be rather complicated. So I'm going to read to you how complicated it became. Quote unquote. In June 2007, Airbrecht and 2 other project members abandoned their own failing translation to join a team of the drama-free Mandolin team, a team of rival translators. Their project began to gather more steam, collecting another translator who had also begun yet another Mother 3 localization, as well as 2 more emulator experts and a programmer who created tools to integrate the language patch into the game. At this point in time in the project, Mandolin noted that team members tended to come and go fairly regularly, with the team retaining 20 members at its peak. Again, like Airbrecht's team, working in the time between class and the job that NetShu at Paytech was tiring, and not being paid for a project of this scope comes with the unfortunate side effects of resentment and burnout. So that's 20 people, Mike.
Yeah.
20 people working on a single fan translation. This kind of passage really illustrates that these are not sort of like pressboard factories of people trying to translate as fast as possible. These are folks that have some sort of very, very deep communal or emotional connection to the game they're translating and are putting their back into getting it right. This article goes on to use that translation patch as the basis for talking about the industry as a whole. And I think that this will shed a little light on why this issue of fan translation is so widespread. More quotes. Localization takes time, energy, and resources, sometimes as much as it does to initially make the game. And for this reason, companies without the bandwidth to spare never bring their games to Western shores. A quote from later in the passage reads, "There are all kinds of weird legal gray areas." Mark McDonald, executive director of localization company 84, told Polygon. "Sometimes it takes a few years for a game to come out. Sometimes it just seems like the game won't come out in the West and then it will years later. With things like the Virtual Console, which is a digital storefront, things don't have to be manufactured. The overhead cost can be lower, so it's easier to bring these smaller niche titles out years after the fact." That's a big part of it there that we were talking about why these localizations are such a big deal in the first place. And I think that passage about them costing as much as the actual development is quite telling.
If you're not experienced with like any sort of ROM hacking or like, or at least have like a basic idea of like how that kind of stuff works, it's not as simple as like, oh, you have a script for this game and you're doing a find and replace. Like you're spending a lot of time in a hex editor where you have to change text at specific memory addresses, and they're not always sequential. Like you may sometimes have fragments of a sentence at one memory address, and then somewhere completely else in the ROM, or like at least a few addresses down, you've got another like completely different portion of maybe another sentence, or maybe of that specific sentence. It takes a lot more than just somebody who speaks both languages.
Oh, absolutely. And even if you did speak just two languages, I mean, translation is also a little more complicated than that. In my studies of literature that I did in college, I did a lot of work on translation, actually, because I was curious about it. And there are a lot of different schools of thoughts as to what the best approach towards translation is. So I find it to be an art. We're running into yet another moment on this show where individual communities of people who like video games are finding a way to prioritize that artistic expression over the needs of the market. So this last bit is interesting to me because it's a case study of one particular guy who was working on one particular game. This is a college student who worked on a game called Valkyria Chronicles 3 and was the first to translate this highly anticipated game into English. I'll use some more quotes here from the article. "Some project starts are a little more rocky and a little more lonely. On the other side of the globe, Christopher Ting, then a student, was dreaming of a localization for a Sega-published PlayStation portable RPG, Valkyria Chronicles 3. He spent months wishfully daydreaming about a translated game. He didn't think to work on his own fan translations, however, until he stumbled upon a kindred spirit on the GameFAQs message boards. A few years ago, I was in Taiwan and I saw Valkyria Chronicles 3 for sale," Ting explained. "I bought it, even though the game was in Japanese and I couldn't understand it. I speak Chinese, so I found an unofficial Chinese patch and played the game and enjoyed it. I realized it was unfair that so many people who love the series don't get to play the game because it's not in English. On GameFAQs, the community pool of video game walkthroughs and completion tips, Ting found a thread about creating a translation patch for Valkyria Chronicles 3, led by a mysterious programmer going by the name of Nightleech."
My favorite superhero.
Him, Spawn, Blood Guy. I like all the cool ones.
I thought Spawn was the blood guy.
I mean, he's got cousins.
Okay.
Spawn's cousins. Cousin of Spawn.
That does not sound menacing at all.
Nightleech, the programmer, whose real identity remains a mystery to Ting, even now, posted screenshots to the forum showing he could insert text into the game files, and after seeing them, Ting decided to take the leap. "I thought, you know what? I have decent confidence in my own English writing abilities," he said. "Originally, I began trying to transcribe everything myself. Then I set up a website and asked for volunteers. Nightleech was able to extract the text files from the game, and with the help from the team that made the Chinese patch, we were able to build full scripts in both Japanese and Chinese to work with." Ting buckled down with Nightleech, the mystery man who had helped make an English version of Valkyria Chronicles 3 a reality. Ting noted to Polygon that despite the length of time they worked together, You never really knew who this programmer was. Hiding your identity in this line of pro bono works with one large benefit: anonymity. The bonus of being harder to track down. That is wild that you would have these many people who have no knowledge of each other and spend no time together working on a project like that.
I've actually experienced something like this pretty recently, though.
The
Phantasy Star Nova for the Vita. Of course, Phantasy Star Online 2 didn't get released in the West for a long time. It finally is now, but it has a companion game that was released on the Vita in Japan that doesn't have an English translation, and there's a group working on one now, and it's to the point where it's playable, but there's a Discord server where they have the landing room that you get put in that has instructions on how to get started submitting chunks of translation to the project. So it's almost crowdsourced
to the point where the anonymity, as the article was saying, is almost a part of it, right? If you see some guy named oh God, I don't know, Snow Cone Lover, and he shows up and he just offers to work on your game, are you going to turn him down?
I don't know. I mean, but that's why I do everything under the alias the Mike Bachmann.
You got to keep them guessing.
Yep. Hold a little back, then they're always wanting more.
My question would be, how many of these game translations have similarly complicated, complex stories that we're never going to hear? The story of Valkyria Chronicles 3 is literally a guy contacts a stranger in another country and they come together to make one game and then never talk or connect to each other again. There's so much of the internet that we've already lost, and I feel like that's kind of the stories that do get lost in the process.
The other weird thing is that a lot of this stuff was done on forums and things. Some of it was private messages for sure, but those forums were at least archived somewhere generally,
generally speaking,
where you can go back and find large chunks of it. But a lot Discord in a lot of ways has replaced that kind of forum community for a lot of these things. And
that's very true.
And that stuff's just, I mean, there's I don't know of any meaningful way to scrape any of that stuff. So that stuff's just going to be stories for anything that happens from here on out is going to be really hard to come by.
Right. And I think a big part of this too is that the internet was meant to be a public good. Businesses exist on it, but it exists due to the grace of being a public good. Discord is not a public good. So if all of these communities have migrated to a community that is owned and regulated by a single corporation, I think history has shown us plenty of times that corporations don't give a fuck about things like archiving or keeping things accessible.
Right.
Whereas that was a huge part of the internet that was kind of baked into the ideology of the internet's earliest boosters, was that this free trade of information would change the world. One thing I also think is really interesting about these articles, in the process of basically just bombing around on GameFAQs and randomly DMing people, these people are doing the equivalent of millions of dollars of labor for free.
Yeah.
That really struck me. You don't know Night Leech. Based on the name, he's clearly cool. But,
for sure.
For sure.
He drives a Camaro. Come on.
But you also don't know who he is. And you two helped release a game that became popular enough to spur Sega, the official publisher of the game, to make a new Western release for the fourth game. You're seeing this sort of anarchic energy in the internet trickling up into games in really interesting ways.
I know the feeling of putting work into say modifying consoles, or just doing in that case, I'm not generating anything for the company, but I'm doing something. I'm making something that was released by a company better because I enjoy the process of doing it. And in the case of, say, Valkyria Chronicles 3, putting that out and it being released then generates another one, and that's not payment at all.
Right.
And I guess there's also the aspect of after spending the number of hours required to translate Valkyria Chronicles 3, you might never want to see another fucking Valkyria Chronicles game again in your life. So, you know what? Maybe it's not even worth mentioning.
There is an enthusiast element to fan translations.
Yeah.
When you go over to romhacking.net, for instance, where you're going to see the highest number of fan translations are genres like role-playing games with 80 hours of playtime and 1 billion statistics to consider, because it is the enthusiast audience that is drawn to these things in the first place. You're not going to find a lot of translated games that maybe only had, 40, 50 letters of text, but are a sports game.
Even if you're doing something like this because you enjoy it, there's a lot of people that love their jobs that they get paid for too.
Yeah, exactly. My God, yes.
enjoying it shouldn't preclude you from getting compensated.
Get your money. For God's sakes, get your money. So why is fan translation necessary? That's a modern question, you know? I mean, obviously, game distribution is a lot different than the days of floppy disks in the 90s. But fan translations are relevant because, as we were discussing, game companies have to justify the cost of their localizations. Fans don't. During the times of, say, the 80s and 90s, 2000s, there were really limited options when it came to hiring translators for video games. And I've decided to look at the work of one particular well-known translator. His name is Ted Woosley. He translated a lot of Nintendo and Squaresoft games in the 90s with lots of text. And his official translation work is a huge difference in terms of what he did and how much labor was involved compared to these sort of enthusiast communities with 20 people contributing and for free. This quote blew my mind, Mike, because he's talking about translating a Final Fantasy game. I played the finished Japanese version of the game 3 times, then, having videotaped the appearances of the characters, I will sit down and work out a translation that seems to work in English, but will also work with the original Japanese source code. And then if there's time, I can start adapting the game to more non-Japanese tastes. The reason why this blows my mind is because oftentimes he had maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month to do this solo. Jesus. He wasn't doing the programming, but he was doing everything else.
Of course there wasn't time. You played a Final Fantasy game 3 times in a row.
He talks in the article I used, it's on chronocompendium.com, /term/Superplay Magazine Woosley interview. He talks about how they would just send him the game and that was it. And then he would turn around handwritten notepads and movie scripts for it. It was so disconnected compared to what we're seeing fancy.
See, I was about to suggest that maybe doing an official translation, you would have some sort of communication with like anybody who worked on the original game to be like, you know, is this what you meant here? Or like, and maybe in some like high profile ones, that's the case, but damn, I guess not, huh?
Yeah. No, not so much. I mean, the funny thing about video games is that like there's a lot of money in it now and it's much bigger culturally than it was in the past. So there's this real desire to like canonize older games and go like, oh my God, nothing will beat the writing in those games. And then you look into the reality of it. It's like, oh, it's one guy in a small apartment. He had 2 days to play it and he ate nothing but macaroni and cheese uncooked. Like, here's another thing that's really interesting to me about why fan translations are necessary. At the time, especially in the 90s, popular genres of video games were considered to be unpopular in the United States and not worth the cost to translate. Japanese RPGs, visual novels, dungeon crawlers, these are all sort of games where the expenditure of translation would be much higher than your average project. It would be ridiculous to me to say that like modern games aren't RPG games or that visual novels are literally more popular in English language markets than they ever have been, while still pointing out at the same time that this is a game industry and a game media that tells you that those things aren't marketable. Your tastes are shaped by these things, you know? I would argue that a lot of games like Final Fantasy V, Mother 3, Cave Story would never really been made available to the people in the US without these fan translation groups because they would have been unmarketable games.
Yeah, sure. It's wild to me, especially as popular as Cave Story was.
And so profitable.
Yeah, I would say too profitable.
So the interviewer also asked Woosley why Final Fantasy V wasn't translated officially. Are you ready?
Uh-huh.
As for Final Fantasy V, we're sure it's a great title that hasn't been hit with too many people in our focus groups. Final Fantasy V is not accessible enough to the average gamer. They tried to change the game, and Woosley said the tentative working title at the moment was Final Fantasy Extreme.
Is that the Game Boy Color port?
Listen to that. Americans just aren't capable of understanding it.
Listen, Americans can't handle Final Fantasy V. We know what they really want. It's Spirits Within.
And also the idea that this incredibly rudimentary, easy to play game, it's like, the problem is that it's not extreme enough, actually. So we haven't learned how to market to imaginary kids riding BMX bikes.
Yeah, people just don't understand the amount of work that it would have gone into putting skateboards into all the sprites.
Last bit of why fan translations are necessary. Here's the real fun thing. Game companies rely on fans translator because of their free labor. And there are a lot of examples of illegal fan translation work showing up on resumes that then lead to official work in the games industry, i.e. paid work, meaning that the other work, whether or not it's used by the company, remains unpaid. This was the case back in 1996. And in some cases, companies use these unofficial translations without licensing the transcript from the translation groups. Meaning, companies can sue a fan for translating their game, then use the translation in a published version of the game and profit off of the translator's work. The person doing the work is the one absorbing all of the risk.
Woof. I mean, I knew about the the virtual console, like NES ROM headers stuff where it's like, no, this is literally like Nintendo dumped Emu Paradise before filing a cease and desist.
Yeah, Nintendo's got the one functional Saturn emulator just in there, and they're keeping it from us. The reality of the translators taking all the risk, even though they don't get the money, is so endemic to the game industry that it would require a severe cultural shift.
Yeah.
To quote Woosley, one thing I guess a lot of people don't realize is the difference between a fan translator and a professional translator isn't that big. It's a matter of experience level. People who get into professional translation always start doing it for fun or as a hobby. In fact, I'm completely serious when I say that every professional translator I've ever known has started as a fan translator. Usually someone will find the way they like translating or sharing stuff from other cultures, so they'll translate stuff they enjoy. I think most translation localization managers expect job applicants to have done personal projects for experience or fan enthusiasm. And look, this is not exclusive to video games. I mean, you're told to have a GitHub if you're a coder, right? You're expected to have a roll of videotape if you're expecting a job based on your video. But I think it's pretty clear that the pipeline from amateur to professional here is whether or not you do enough amateur work that is unpaid, and then maybe you'll get paid for it. Who knows? I find it to be a sort of one of the weirder aspects of video game business. There's a ton of these practices and communities dedicated to this stuff, but formal game companies can't really acknowledge it because they benefit from them.
I've got a lot of feelings about this, but not a lot of words.
Listeners, we had to cut out Mike headbutting his wall.
Doing those haymakers you're hearing so much about at the top of the episode. It's a weird thing where it's like, yeah, like coders have to have a GitHub and like you have to have a demo reel if you're going to be like an animator or something. But like neither one of those requires you to have like violated an intellectual property law first.
Right, exactly. And like to use a comparison for other pieces of artwork, you hire a translation expert, someone who knows something about prose, someone with some experience with poetic language, because you can never really translate one-to-one between languages.
Yeah.
Whereas this is just like, hey, did you really like Mega Man? Well, did you like it enough to modify the game code to change his name to, I don't know, Sepultura or something? Well,
Mega Dan.
Well, then here's your job, my friend. Thank you. I wouldn't say it makes video games seem small, but it does make video games seem like a place where creative labor isn't always valued very much.
I think that's putting it mildly.
I'm going to go down to the section here of how to play these games, because I think that is very relevant. We've been talking about them for a long time, but as always, we want to provide some real practical help here. So I made a quick list. I think emulation is going to be your best option here. Emulation is you're using your computer or your phone to mimic a game console. You can find a lot of translated games that work really well with emulators, and you don't necessarily have to put together the translations yourself. Although the patches themselves are not necessarily illegal to distribute, the ROMs, i.e. the game images, are unless you own a copy of the game yourself. So you're already breaking the law by using a translation patch. Kind of, maybe, who knows?
Which is why I own a complete set of everything from everything before the Xbox 360. I'm just a really good collector. That's why I have all those ROMs. No other reason.
Hell yeah. You should see it. He's got a big old game pool. And he just throws them into the pool.
Yeah, they're in there. Yeah, I feel like it's like one of those gotcha moments. Like police show up at my door. It's like prove to us you have a copy of Growlancer. And I was like, well, you're welcome to look through my collection. And it's just a giant like the Springfield tire fire. It's just like a big pile in my backyard of games. And they're like, what are we gonna do?
The CIA busts into your house and you're standing on your chair like that guy from Death Note, and you're like, oh, excuse me, officer, I believe I have 24 hours to delete those ROMs. One thing that I think is also interesting about these translation patches is that you don't necessarily need to be a translation patch from one language to another. There are a lot of translation patches that retranslate, maybe writing over poorly existing English localizations, or just offering different approaches on the same script. Another thing you could do with this translation approach here is that you could look into some of the newer emulation features, such as auto translate, which is a feature built into RetroArch, a popular emulator suite. This suite allows you to have the Google Translate app try to translate your game on the fly. And this is where I handed off like an expert quarterback to my friend Mike here, because you did a thing.
Yeah,
we did a thing.
We did. And, they say that you can't, like Jay was saying, you can't really translate language one-to-one. There's a lot of nuance there, but not to a computer. And not to, and absolutely not to, I would say not even to humans at Google. But there's this feature is nice, and yes, it will just directly translate what's on your screen. But what if there's an analog element to that? And so there is a Google Translate app for phones, for iOS and Android. Maybe your Zune, I don't know. It's meant for traveling abroad. You point it at a sign, it'll give you a loose translation of what that game is saying. And so we played a couple of untranslated Sega Saturn games.
Yes.
Where I put my phone on a tripod with the app open and then streamed it to my computer and played using the video feed from my phone, which then looked like garbage. And oh my God, because it's meant to be like pointed at signs and your camera is going to be moving all over the place. Instead of just taking one sample of the text on screen, if you're doing it through RetroArch, it's got the data for like what text is being shown on screen, or at least it has a very high resolution scan of it, if nothing else. And it can do that translation, and it only has to do it once unless what's on the screen changes. But because they're expecting you to move your phone around with this app and point it at different things, it's constantly polling. And that means that if your camera's focus changes or like anything, it's going to redo it and it's going to come up with a different result. And so you'd have instances where it's like you just kind of see like 5 or 6 things that the person could possibly be saying, and then just choose your favorite. It's definitely the least effective way.
Yeah, I was about to say, one of the games that we spend a lot of time with is a game that I have always held a torch for, called Linda Cube. It's never been translated into English. This game is relatively text-y. There's a lot of story stuff in it. And boy, did we give our translation engine some patience to really try to figure out what was going on there and tell us a clear story. It's really not capable of that, though. This feature's fine for games that aren't text-heavy, but a lot of the games left untranslated that people have an interest in translating are quite text-heavy. So it's a useful feature, but not a universal feature. And if you're interested in seeing us dink around with Google Translate, you can head on over to our Twitch page. That's twitch.tv/GameCrimes. And you can see us trying to build this translation engine and doing what we can with it. It's not the worst.
It's definitely the most fun that I've had doing it.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think it is way more interesting than like doing it the normal way, but
it's more interesting and less effective, and therefore we are all in.
Yes.
So let's say you are a collector, right? Like you were saying, you like to have physical copies of your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There is a phenomenon that's been popping up in recent years called reproductions or repros. And these are translated games using one of these translation patches like we discussed, actually flashed to a cartridge or a disc and then sold through legal channels or sometimes less than legal channels. But it's actually become a recent trend in the recent years for game publishers, game developers, specialty companies to purchase the licenses for obscure works, get those fan translations, and then actually have a first-time formal release. A good example here would be the game Holy Diver. The big negative here is that you will end up usually paying out the teeth for these repro cards. Do you have any repros yourself, Mike?
Oh, God, do I? I don't think so. I think I flirted with it a number of times. I never actually ended up picking one up.
I've seen them come through stores and they look great. They're almost like indistinguishable from other cards. But at the same time, it's like, they're not legit. They might run on the normal system, but the label looks a little different, or
right.
It's just different enough to look off. Now, of course, another option is if you're here to talk about translations, you can always look at what the big companies are doing. So, for instance, Nintendo has been plugging away at its retro catalog, I guess. That's the theory, at least. And they have recently decided to do one of their own official translations for one of their older games, an NES game, Fire Emblem, that they will then release in a new form through the digital distribution service. I wouldn't wait up for game companies to be doing this work, though, to be frank. That Fire Emblem game has had a translation patch for 20 years, I think, 2015, something like that. That's the fun stuff. We just gave you a quick tour around the world, so to speak. But we also have some game reviews to do. We always do game reviews on this show. And you can watch us play the games that we review here on our Twitch channel. That's twitch.tv/gamecrimes. And for this episode, I decided to present Mike with two games in the spirit of the episode. They both have fan translations, and both I would consider to be ridiculously unmarketable within English language markets. I think once we talk about them, you can see why. The first game that we're talking about today is called Garage: Bad Dream Adventure. This is a 1999 Japanese horror game. It is a graphic adventure a la Myst, developed by Kinotrope and published by Toshiba. The game itself was designed by a surreal artist, Tomimi Sakuba. I have some more information about this game involving the really unique circumstances behind it getting translated. But Mike, what were your just impressions of playing Garage?
I feel like I tend to get lost, especially in like the PS1 era of games. I tend to get lost in those kind of games like very easily, where it was like kind of this early thing of like that era of like you can click on things. This very like Windows 95, like Windows 3.1, where they're like, oh, we can have things that don't look like buttons that you can click on and they'll make noise and shit. And so they did a lot of that in this game, but it's always, it's like, as a result, like, I don't feel like the industry had really learned how to telegraph like what you should click on and what it'll do. So while it was very surreal and I was getting like, I was interested in where it would go, I did not have the patience to get very far.
Yeah, for sure. This is a sort of game genre that I would say is lost now. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'd say so. The elements of these games, it was a time where like they could put in these elements, but not really other elements because of the way they were designing them. Like when you talk about Myst, like Myst had this like 3D environment where it's not like they could have really rendered that environment in a real time and added a combat system or like something like that.
Right. Yeah.
So you get elements of what Myst was, but in other games that are like a broader genre, I would say.
For sure. And I would say for the listeners, if you're not familiar with this type of adventure game, what I would call a scavenger hunt game where you are presented with this incredibly busy screen with a billion things you could possibly touch, but you have to touch the right one to make the game go forward. It can be incredibly disorienting. You do the same thing forever. You just click on a billion things forever. You don't even know if the thing you clicked on is necessarily what moved the game forward. One thing that Garage does quite well, though, is all of the in-game components seem to be handcrafted. There's a lot of like puppet work and woodwork and like metal sculptures in this game.
Yeah.
That it almost makes it seem like this is a more of an interactive art gallery than anything else.
They didn't really talk in terms that you could like easily parse out early on either. So like I forget what the resource was that they kept telling me I didn't have enough of. No, they said you don't have your voice.
Yeah, your voice.
Yeah, which I understand in theory, but like but also they gave me like one dude seemed to give me directions on where to go to have my voice, and then I went to that dude and he told me I didn't have my voice. And I was like, okay.
You kind of just summed up the experience of playing the game, I think. The premise of the game is that you are reborn as like a robot. Like you're a human being who is reborn in a robot's body, essentially. But you're like a weird robot who is really wacky and edgy and like, oh, he's made with mixed media art in the late 90s. Maybe he's cool. It's indicative of the rest of the experience forward, because you as this robot just kind of wander around confused, not sure what to do or what's going on. There's no one to tell you what's going on. And I think that the artist intentionally went out of their way to make the environment look very unearthly. Very like the surreal part of this is actually, I feel like it gets nailed out of the park.
I will say I kind of identified somewhat with the environment because it was like made from old barnwood. And as like somebody who grew up with horses and had to be like in a lot of like barns that made him uncomfortable. This is like this I felt right at home in the worst way.
Oh, yeah. As soon as you see some rotting farmhouse wood, you're like, I'm at home. And also there's a good chance I'm going to get injured.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Love to get injured.
Love to step on those big nails, brother.
I've had my tetanus shot.
So I picked Garage for a specific reason, Mike. It's not just that I like it, although I do. The first release of this game was limited to 3,000 copies. So only 3,000 copies of Garage existed in Japan when it was released. And the game's publisher actually withdrew from publishing altogether during the print run, meaning that there's likely even fewer than that in the wilderness. So in Japan, where the game was released, considered extremely rare, with only maybe a few thousand copies in existence. The last time it appeared on a trading site like eBay, which it went for the equivalent of more than $3,000.
Wow.
Right? Like, I mean, I like this game, but it's not $3,000 good. The reason why we're able to enjoy Garage now is actually due to, of all places, 4chan, the worst website on the internet, at least in a high contender.
4chan.com, the only reason the owner of Hitler.com can sleep at night.
Garage was a fascination of 4chan's video game board. And when the copy of Garage showed up on auction, pooled a bunch of money together to purchase a copy of it. From there, a translation patch was made. They purchased this game. A fan translation patch was made based on this purchase, and the game's creator does not own the rights to it anymore, so it will likely no longer be manufactured. With the permission of the original game creator, this digital version and translation patch has been made available online in the year 2020 for anyone to enjoy and download. I think this has a really interesting story behind it, because it's very rare that you can actually say, this rare, weird, lost thing, people just grabbed it and made it work. What do you think is going on with this game that it became such an object of fascination?
I mean, I think anytime that something's like something is known but inaccessible, it just, it becomes bigger than itself.
True.
It's,
Very true.
It's like, take Paprium, okay. Being this, like this, Genesis game that has been in development for like over 8 years and has gone through like a ton of like development trouble. And some people that backed it got it, some people didn't. And there may not be a second run, but who knows? Like, I didn't want it until I knew all that stuff. And I'm just like, oh man, I wish I had a copy of that. It's like, oh, this mysterious game that, that they only made 1,500, however many copies they ended up making, and you can't play. Of course, people are going to latch onto that.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's exciting, right? There's this thing that you can't have, and there's photos of it, and you can touch it. And one of the other unique things about Garage is that within this genre, Garage stands out. I played a lot of those style adventure games during the time they were coming out in the 90s. Garage has a lot of personality. It's very unique. None of these other adventure games look like it. And I would say that a large part of that is due to the kind of sort of like atmosphere that the game creates.
That type of thing's happening, like, seems to be happening more and more too, as like things just get uncovered. Like that, like Dinosaur Planet, the N64 version of what became Star Fox Adventures, like a pretty close to content complete version gets discovered, and like then a scene forms around it to start working on like actually putting it back together so you can see what that thing originally was. There's always stuff like, you know, stories of like a box with like source code being kept, like being stuffed up in above a dropped ceiling, is just all over the place. Whereas like I think we're in this point where we're gonna have this period of that stuff happening more and more, where like we're to like the nostalgia area of stuff that was on media that would have survived the amount of time it takes to get to this point. And then we're gonna like slowly work through all of that stuff that's available and get to, okay, now stuff is like was being put out on the internet and like worked on like as it came out. So now there's less of those stories.
Yeah, for sure.
There may still be stories like this that come out, but I feel like there's gonna be less after a while.
I actually got to disagree with you on the last part, because I'm with you on everything else up until there will be less. Because I think that what's happening here is kind of a conflagration of two broader ideas that have been leaking into video games for the last few years. People are kind of realizing that video game companies are not great stewards of history.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is not hard to find people actually complaining about Nintendo's labor practices now. Whereas 10 years ago, that was not really a thing. You know, there's a lot of contemporary criticism of some of their distribution policies, things like that, to where people are going, hey, maybe this weird relationship with this video game company where I become a fan of them like a sports team, it kind of has unintended consequences.
Sure.
But I think the other thing that's crossing over with that I think is actually much broader than video games is a desire to return to a pre-content model of art that I think is a large part nostalgia. But it's a nostalgia for like a different type of art, if that makes sense. Not necessarily a piece of art in general.
Yeah.
Now everybody makes their own art and puts it online, and it's theirs, and they can go and say whatever fool thing they want. Thank you for listening. The pre-content era is very much this sort of like, there's a history. You can follow this one particular company you like. You know, if you like this one game, logging onto a single ROM site will allow you to see 30 other games in that series. And that's really not how people were engaging with those things at the time. The whole like Earthbound Zero story about how we only know that Nintendo translated the first Earthbound because someone found it at a garage sale. That is not exactly a well-known story or anything, right? But it's a huge part of history that kind of just got uncovered because people like this neat, inaccessible stuff that has kind of a shine on it because of that inaccessibility. People are trying to take back history, I think, or at least there's some sense of their own history. Let's move on to the next game we reviewed. This one, Mike, I feel like you were about ready to commit your life to understanding in a cabin in the woods somewhere. And that game is called LSD Dream Emulator. It was developed and published in 1998 by Asmic Ace, conceived by Osamu Sato, another multimedia artist.
LSD is the only reason I want a PS1 core in the Mister.
Instead of me describing what happens in this game, why don't you give just a quick, brief impression to the audience here?
Oh God, what doesn't happen? You start alone in the woods. You walk around the corner and you see a fireplace. But what's on the fireplace? It's a bat. The bat kills you. You wake up. You're now alone in the same house. You walk around that corner expecting to see the bat. You don't. You see a cave. In that cave is a fountain. A giant monolith, perhaps to your failure, perhaps to something much more sinister to come. Holy shit. Like there's a horse. You run towards the horse, but the horse is always just out of your reach, a prize you cannot possess. Why do you want that horse? You don't know. It's maybe because it's there, maybe because you're alone in this world and you know you always will be. I'm not talking about the game when I say that. Holy shit, this game, like, I don't understand what's happening. They give you Am I remembering correctly that they give you stats? I had a fever dream. They like give you rewards, but I don't know what they mean. It almost doesn't matter. Like, you're too busy trying to figure out what just happened.
So if we were to go like real boring with it, the whole premise of the game is it's a first person game where there's no combat, there's only movement. And anytime you touch anything, a wall, an object, anything, a new world is procedurally generated around you. And there are themes of things that show up. I think Mike actually experienced a nightmare horse multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that every time you open the game up, you're going to get some sort of different dream.
I think the nightmare horse is tapping into some unresolved feelings that I have from growing up with horses. And resenting my family for making me, deal with their hobby that I had no interest in. I'm very much invested in the idea that this PS1 ROM was trying to tell me things.
It's a personal attack. So this game is like, that's the most boring way to describe it. I think that Mike's description is actually the best.
You described what you do in the game. I described how you feel when you're playing the game.
Yes. Practically, you only spend about, 10, 15 minutes at a dream before it just brings you back to the title screen and you can do it all over again.
It seems much shorter than that, but also somehow an eternity.
I believe that we had to cut you off at 90 minutes because you're like, I want to keep playing this forever.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Some say we would still be there.
This game is another one of those games that definitely would never have been brought over to the West. I cannot see anyone publishing this, period. But it is fascinating. It's a fascinating game. The artist who conceived it, Osamu Sato, is not really into games and didn't like games. He wanted to use the PlayStation as a medium for art, which is just like when you make a game that isn't fun to play. But this game is fun to play. This game's concept is actually based on a real-life dream diary that was kept by an employee at the game developer. This employee kept the diary for over a decade, and everything that shows up in the game that's procedurally generated is based on her dreams. So that dream journal that she wrote, you can actually read. It was released alongside the game as a booklet called Lovely Sweet Dream. That means that you can read these dreams that this other person is having and then go and have Mike's experience where you actually live through them. What she said about the game is, quote unquote, there's a difference between actual dreams and remembered dreams. Even the ones recorded in my dream diary are different than the real thing. The dreams reconstructed by the artists that read them are different as well. Just don't analyze them or read too much into them. Enjoy this book as if you're walking through a dream. It's too late for that, buddy. This game was also fan translated recently in 2020. Do you know why this game would need a fan translation, Mike?
I don't.
Because after you do X number of dreams, you are presented by written pieces of art, poetry, that have something to do with the dream.
Didn't we see some of that?
Yeah. The game itself is like a poetry repository, a visual art gallery. The music is great sound effects. I don't know. This is a weird ass game, but in the best possible way.
I don't even know how you would do this while still remaining like faithful to the original. But like, I want more. I want this game to just have access to a much bigger library than what it does.
Yeah.
I mean, because after a while, like, seeing that demon horse again, like, no, it's still like I chased after it just as hard the second time. But just like, being able to just like, I would stay in this game for a long time, probably longer than I played WoW.
Thing that really strikes me about LSD is an experience I had with it about 10 years ago or so, where I think I put about 10 hours into this game the first time I discovered it. And just for reference, Mike, I never saw a horse, so maybe it is telling you something.
Oh, wow.
The experience I had was that I was playing it at the same time as a couple of other people on a game forum I was going to. And what surprised us in the discussion was how little overlap there was in our experiences. That when people talked about what the game looked like to them, it was like, yeah, that's the setup. We were doing the first person walking and touching. But what they felt and what order and sequence of events and even the colors of things, never really one-to-one. Let's wrap this up. we've got 2 games to discuss, and let's just give it a simple, should our listeners give this a shot? Let's start with Garage. Mike, what would you say? Should our listeners give Garage a shot?
You gotta have a level of patience that I am not prepared to. No, I mean, I would pass on it personally. I mean, unless you're just really into like that era of like adventure, not even adventure games, of that like exploration, like point and click exploration kind of game. Like, it's too confusing.
I think Mike's totally right here. The vast majority of people are going to try to play this game and get very overwhelmed and bored very quickly. I went and picked up this game after we streamed it and grabbed a walkthrough online.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I found that after about an hour or so of playing the game, I kind of had a pretty good impression of what I was going to be seeing. And I think that if you are into sort of unique visual presentations, games that, for lack of a better way to put it, could be called ugly and pretty at the same time, Garage does have a lot going for it. But I would actually side with Mike here and say it's probably not worth your time unless you have these interests in the first place. As for LSD, Mike, how do you feel about LSD?
Oh, God, everybody should play this. It's cheaper than a therapist. It will show you a side of yourself that you've never known. I feel like this game knows me better than my wife. It's, I want to raise my children inside this game.
Well, and it introduced you to that horse that lives outside your window now.
Yes, absolutely. It's crazy how low poly the real world is now.
Yeah, it's low poly. It's not that you've gone like your eyes are pointed in 2 different directions from too much internet. I would say definitely play this game. This game rules. It's so interesting. And even if you only spent 20 minutes with it, I guarantee you would have an experience, a unique experience, unlike anything else. This game is relatively hard to find these days, but like I said, recently patched in 2020, so it's out there.
All right!
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Game Crimes Episode 5, the story of fan translations. I've had a great time bringing this to you. I know it's more of a little low-key episode, but that's all right. It's the first in a 3-part series on game communities. And next up, we will be talking about ROM hacking and communities as social projects and the ways in which corporate interests intersect with historical narratives. My name is Jay. You can find me online _JAYHI5. We're going to be talking about Sonic Mania.
Hell yeah.
The Sonic the Hedgehog retro game released in 2017 that was actually created by a team of well-intentioned ROM hackers who later made Sega publish their own damn game. But before we get there, I have to do all the boring business shit and sign off. My name is Jay. You can find me on Twitter at Opal and Juniper. You can also find me on the SHU Podcast telling superhero sci-fi stories about corporate robots ending all life in the universe.
I'm Mike Bachmann. You can find me on Twitter at the Mike Bachmann. Find me on the Greetings Adventurers podcast, which is at D&D Podcast. You can also find me like 256 polygons deep in a static downer in LSD.
Now, I would really, really encourage you to come back next month for the next episode in our series on communities, Gold Medal Games, Sonic Mania. And not just because Sonic the Hedgehog is involved and we all love that little rascal, but because we're actually going to be joined by our first ever guest, Sid Menon from the We Thought About Games podcast. And I think we had a hell of a discussion. So come on back next time we release one of these bad boys. And until then, happy gaming, nerds.
Bye.